All right. Well, welcome to the Wolfpack Wellness Research Web Series, and I'm your host, Dr. Susie Goodell. This series is a collaboration between the University Wellness Advisory Committee, the NC State Libraries, and NC State Wellness and Recreation. We aim to discuss the wellness research happening across campus. Today's guest is Dr. Jason. I always have to stop and say Beccaro because I want to put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. But Dr. Beccaro is, I'll let him tell you much more about him, but he is a faculty member in Parks Rec Tourism Management in the College of Natural Resources, and he has tons of different awards related to teaching and research, and his focus tends to be around physical fitness, physical activity, and how that impacts physical, mental health, and other avenues. So we're just going to leave it at that for now. And so I forgot to ask you, what would you prefer me to refer to you as?
Oh, you can call me anything.
Just not late for supper, right?
Yeah, you can call me Jason. I'm very
Okay.
informal.
Okay, I'll call you Jason. A lot of people are fine with that. So, okay. So we are so glad you were able to join us today. And the first thing I'm just going to ask you is tell us a little bit about you and your research lab.
Sure. So I've been at NC State now for 17 years. Can't believe it's been that long. And I was at the University of New Hampshire before that for 5 years. I'm now the new director of an initiative called the James Buzzard Leadership Development Program. And then January 1st also, I was appointed the Shelton Owens Distinguished Professor of Global Leadership. So now I'm sort of doing probably way too much and being less focused than I need to be. But today, my research, I would say, focuses on three overarching themes, which my current projects revolve around. And, as we discuss, Susie, I can talk about any of them, whatever you want to talk about. But just generally, like my first theme, I would say, looks at the relationship between the environment and public spaces and how that impacts human health, physical, social, psychological health, which certainly includes programming within those spaces, be it parks, sport programming. And it's also included who has access to those spaces and programs, which certainly bleeds into some of my advocacy and policy research. And we've been fortunate enough that our research has actually impacted policy in the state of North Carolina. And I could talk about that more if you want. And then the work has also bled into some of the programming. For example, as we talked about, we had a project called Thinking Outside the Pillbox, which was motivated by the fact that more and more Americans, and actually people around the world, are reliant on prescription medication. And so the genesis behind this was, what could we do to start taking preventative health a little bit more seriously? So we partnered with some federally qualified health centers in Eastern North Carolina to look at a part prescription type program, working with some of the medical providers there, really focused on pre-diabetic, diabetic, and hypertensive patients that could benefit from kind of a formal prescription program. And then I would, we've also worked in, being at NC State and a land grant university, we really want our research to have impact within the community. So I would say one of my favorite projects I've ever worked with was a 5-year project with faculty. Actually, it's still ongoing, with faculty in your college, Susie, in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, Annie Hardison Moody, Lindsay Haynes Maslow, Dara Bloom, Sarah Bowen from sociology. It's one of my favorite projects, and it's called Health Matters, where we looked at interventions, community interventions, focus on physical activity, healthy nutrition, and access to food delivery systems in 4 counties in North Carolina. And that was certainly one of my favorite projects. Not only that, because of the impact, but also because of the project team. It was such a great example of just a wonderful team, wonderful human beings, incredibly smart in there. And then, again, we just had an intervention with University Wellness and University recreation and wellness, wellrec.
Well, Rick.
Yeah, and we actually they actually designed a health intervention program for STEM students on campus, and this was just before the pandemic, and it was an intervention where we looked at. They designed an intervention focused on stress, time management, physical activity, um, uh, time management, and we did the evaluation of that project, and that is actually just been accepted for a manuscript in there. But the interesting thing about that was the pandemic hit halfway through the program. So the impact of the pandemic on the program, and did that have any did it kind of buffer against some of the pandemic stuff in there? And then my second theme is really a kind of a random theme. It's the legacy and role of mega sporting events in promoting healthy communities. And that has much more of a global macro outlook to it. That started in 2011-12. There's a random story about how I got involved in that I won't go into now, but we got some funding, 5 countries, to look at the legacy of mega sporting events. And mega sporting events, things like the Olympics, FIFA World Cup, as countries bid for these, less and less countries were bidding for them because it had always been sold to countries that it will generate an economic impact, and people became smarter. So the rhetoric became looked around like, what legacy could these mega events provide communities and cities and countries beyond just the economic legacy? So was there an environmental legacy? Was there a health legacy? And so that piqued my interest, and we got a global team and really looked at those kind of issues, published a book in 2018 looking at called The Legacy of Mega Sporting Events, Facts or Fairy Tales. So that was really cool, and we've just got another 5-year funding looking, and now it's about 12 different countries around the world looking at the issue of human rights and mega sporting events. So that's very, very cool, and part of that is putting on international training schools for young faculty and PhD students all over the world. So we're putting on one in Western University in Canada, Ontario, Canada. I hosted one here at NC State in 2017, which was very cool. And I think I've had about 8 PhD students come to NC State to do from each of the partner institutions. And I've got another 4 coming in the next month or 2. So that's been very cool. And then the third theme of my research is really looking at the sport delivery system and its overall impact on human health, right? Spanning the lifespan, I'd say. So we've had so many projects looking at the youth sport and delivery system. We created a tool with the Aspen Institute based on some of our data, looking called the Healthy Sport Ranking. So, you know, if you're a parent of a kid who wants to get into youth sport, and there's all these different sports that you could get your kid involved in, what are the health impacts that you're most concerned about? Do you want it to have more social psychological benefits? Do you want it to have more physical activity benefits? Or do you want it to have, you know, you're very concerned about injury, so you want that? And so it's a tool where you can actually shift it, and then it ranks the different sports in there so you can make a more informed decision. And it was based on some data that we collected over a 2-year period in high schools across North Carolina. We partnered with some other universities who collected safety and injury data and social psychological data, and we all put it together. So that was cool. We also looked at school sport policy, like, you know, what types of sport delivery systems provide the most amount of opportunity for children. Recently, I've got 2 funded projects looking at issues of mental health facing student athletes. So one just got funded by the NCAA, and we're right in the middle of collecting data from student athletes, and before that we collected data from the actual providers of mental health across college campuses, which is very interesting. Myself and John Casper, who's one of my colleagues, we've just published a whole bunch of articles looking at health of seniors and their impact on sport, particularly around the sport of pickleball. So
Very
that's
timely.
very timely, very interesting in there, and that kind of thing. And then the last thing I'd say is one of, I think, the proudest team projects as well that we've been involved with is looking at the use of how we can use space more effectively, particularly providing for youth sports. So we had a really cool project focused on shared use agreements and joint use agreements, particularly with schools. And that was a project that was very circumstantial in a way. Like we were collecting data in middle schools in Wake County using this systematic observation procedure. And one of the things that we realized was when we and this was a very deliberate time, right? 2:30 to 4:30, right after school, right? So not some crazy hour like 9 o'clock at night. And we just wanted to know, like, collect data on different types of after school sports and how much physical activity different sports, like does track produce more physical activity than, I don't know, softball, or vice versa, like comparing some of the sports. And we did publish something like that. But one of the most interesting findings was in these schools, the spaces were empty at that 2:30 to 4:30 time 68% of the time. So you start thinking about that, and then you start hearing communities complain that there's nowhere to be physically active. And you start to think, well, every community, even under-resourced communities, have schools. And so can we start thinking about shared use agreements, joint use agreements? And we started to look at what are the reasons why schools don't engage and community partners don't engage in shared and joint use agreements. And one of the most fascinating findings was, what do you think, well, I'm going to ask you this, what do you think is the biggest reason why schools don't?
Liability?
That's what everyone says, cost and liability. And that was by far.
Oh, wait, Cindy has a guess.
Yeah, Cindy.
You're muted.
Am I still muted?
No, we can hear you now.
Okay. So the joint use, first I have a question. The joint use agreements would mean non-school people would be using the facility.
Mm-hmm.
Is there concern about not having it available when the school wants to use it?
No, this would be in the non-school hours.
During non-school hours, okay.
Yeah. So the number one reason why they didn't by far was they didn't know where to start. They didn't have the knowledge. So for us, that was really cool because myself and Mike Canters actually partnered with Delta to create a shared use training for community partners. And then we started to run around the state doing trainings for people. In fact, I just did one about a few months ago in Edgecombe County, which was really, really, really cool and really impactful. And it got people excited because there was this real interesting will. And going back to the CDC funded study with Annie Hardison Moody that and everyone else in there.
Yeah.
One of the coolest things was we were working with a school in Halifax County, and this high school was, like many high schools, having a hard time connecting with parents, right? It was in a lower income community, and it was hard to get parents to show up to student parent teacher meetings, really be connected to the school. So we thought, and colleagues thought that we could create a really interesting shared use agreement. I've actually talked on a panel about this, where we, as part of the grant, we retrofitted the school with new gym equipment, but we had to create some kind of joint use agreement or shared use agreement with the school to, that was part of the agreement. And one of the things that we decided to do was open up the school laundry facilities at night so that parents could do their laundry for free. And then while they're waiting for their laundry, some of the coaches did some free workouts using the school facilities. And what that did was it started connecting the parents to the school. right? So that was a very, very cool, unique little shared use agreement, because people think it's like, opening up the track, but there's so many different ways. And we've got examples of, faith communities in Lee County and how they partnered. And that's part of our shared use agreement. We went in and videoed, the faith community leaders in this church in Sanford, asking them why did they engage in this shared use agreement and open up their facilities to non-congregant members, right? Anything from Zumba classes to blood drives to and it really, you see the benefits. It really kind of brings the community together. There's some tremendous benefits out there. So those are just kind of a snapshot of some of the things, health related that I've been involved in. And I'd say the secret to a lot of the project success is the people I work with. I say this all the time, but I'm not joking about this. I love working with people, which isn't hard, that are much smarter than me. And I often I've learned so much through the projects I've worked with people on.
Well, I always say that there are so many people in this world that I get to handpick who I want to work with, because I only want to work with those people like you're talking about. And I've worked with quite a few of the people you're talking about. They are wonderful people. We are very, very fortunate here at NC State to have some amazing people to work with, and community partners too, for sure. So I want to dive deeper, just because we got a little taste of these shared use agreements. I'd love to know a little bit about sustainability within those agreements, because you said that one of the things that was like, sometimes it's grants that are precipitating these initial agreements. Have you been able to look at how long something, for example, that high school piece, is that going to be something that's continued, or was that a one and done kind of deal?
Yeah, so that's certainly up to the community members and that kind of thing. But, one of the things that we wanted to educate people on is that there's these really high formal joint use agreements, which often, should be in place for, say, some of the indoor facilities and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But often there's not necessarily the need so much for some of these outdoor spaces, right? Because yes, we're in America and anyone can sue anyone. But there is a statute called the Recreation Land Use Statutes, which protects people. I mean, as long as you're not charging for the use of that space, it kind of protects you, that you have to show, in a way, gross negligence, that you set out to actually deliberately harm people or someone, right? And people always say, well, what happens if they, fall on, this, there's like, a crack in a tennis court or something like that. Well, often, I mean, hopefully if those facilities are at your school, you're protecting those facilities anyway. Like, even if it's a tape around that, or do not, a sign saying be careful of that, because you've got children anyway for a school or a faith community, you've got people using, general users anyway. So I think some of that is kind of a sustainability. And also, like, one of the things that has also come out is the fact that we live in economic times right now where there's a real need for new schools in growing communities like Raleigh, like other places, because the population's growing. And, often if a new school needs renovations or whatever, there are bond issues that may need to get passed. And it's much more likely to get passed if people that don't have children in the public school system, for example, or, see the school as beyond just a place to educate kids. I mean, one of the things I do in my presentation is how many days in a year is a school used, right? 180. How many hours in a day is it used? 8, right? So if you map that on a graph, look at all this time on that graph, that it's just a real community space that's just unused. And I've got a colleague called Tom McKenzie, he has this quote. He said, an unused facility is a terrible thing to waste, right? And particularly in this time where we want to make spaces for people to be physically active more accessible, particularly for some that don't have access or the resources for some of the other spaces that are more in the private sector within communities like gyms or, you know, YMCAs or whatever.
Yeah, it's so encouraging to hear those partnerships connecting together. And I guess the other things I'd be curious about related to this kind of work is, one, about outcomes other than the sustainability piece. What other kinds of outcomes have you seen? But the other is, if someone's watching this and is like, oh, that sounds interesting, what do they need to do to learn from you?
What do they need to do to learn from me? I mean, they can follow up with me and I can point them to any resources. I mean, we've created toolkits. We've created trainings like our shared use training. You know, myself and one of my old PhD students who's now started her own company, we work with the National Association for State Park Directors, for example, to create a toolkit if they wanted to do health programming within their park, right? So, you know, what are the steps? Why do you do it? And that kind of thing. So we try and create toolkits and trainings to make our research a little bit more, you know, accessible. And our Health Matters program, we had a whole load of resources to provide community members, anything from success stories, right? Like, so some of our team were excellent at writing success stories, like real user-friendly sort of success stories if you wanted to start, you know, a walking audit, because that was one of the other things. I don't know, have you ever gone through a walk audit?
I have not. I'm sure the people who are watching would love to hear what exactly a walk audit is.
Yeah, it was one of our favorite things that we did. We all got trained by a guy from MIT who's you know, really developed these walk audit tools. And I went through it when I was at the CDC, and it's really cool because what you do, you get a very diverse group of community members, right? Anything from, it could be mothers or grandparents, or maybe someone with a disability, people from different racial backgrounds, or, you know, whatever. And you bring them together and you literally go for a walk in your community. And then every X amount of areas you stop and you go like, you know, there's a series of questions and you literally do an audit. And so you start to think about what were the things that made that walk accessible, not accessible, good for you, bad for you, and that kind of thing. And afterwards, it's kind of like you bring that data together, and it's a really good way to, very practical way to share that, right? Well, one of the things that Mark talks about MIT, oftentimes some of the changes that you can make to make your community, your neighborhood, whatever, more accessible and more walkable, or more, you know, physically active friendly, is that there may be, if you have partnerships with the Department of Transportation or whatever, they may be doing some sort of renovations anyway. And so it wouldn't cost any more to put this in or that in, because they're going in there anyway. It's not like they do. And so if you know when they're going in there, you can make some of those changes in there, as well as advocating and that kind of thing. So so those are some of the cool things that we've done there. And then I work with Aaron Hipp. I don't know if you all know.
Yes, he was our first interview way back when.
Yes, so one of my claim to fame, probably one of my biggest successes at NC State was I successfully recruited Aaron to NC State.
That was a good action. We'll thank you for that for years to come.
So and Aaron had he probably talked to you about his work with cameras that he's done. Yeah. So we actually did that in our Health Matters study, that we used cameras to collect data prior to making a change within the community. And the reason why we like that, we like our work to be as practical as we can, but it's a very good way to show legislators, politicians, funders, whatever, some very objective data, like here's what the environment was like before, here's the money you've invested, and oh look, here's like, you know, the increase in use or increase of physical activity. And so, you know, this isn't self-report data, this is actual use data and that kind of thing. So he may have shared with you some of the data that he looked at in terms of bike lanes in DC, right? Like looking at—
He showed us a really cool visual. He had PowerPoints to show those little things.
Of course he
really,
did.
Of course he did. It was really cool to see the kinds of things that he was doing. Yeah, for sure. So going along with, you know, how do you learn about things? Do y'all have, because you've been talking about a couple of different things, do y'all have like a website that is set up to access these trainings, or is that something that you might have in the future? Because you were talking about toolkits.
Yeah, so I think I've got some on my personal website. One of the things that we're going to do with our shared use training, I'm hoping we can do this, is that Delta, Michael Canners and I worked on this with Delta actually, of course. And what happened was it became really burdensome if you weren't at NC State, like the protocol to kind of like get that. We found that with some of our community members. So we're working with a colleague of ours who was at the North Carolina Recreation and Parks Association to find another platform that we can put our training on that is much more user-friendly and that kind of thing. But I can certainly share with anyone that's interested some of our videos and trainings and that kind of thing. Yeah.
That's awesome. So we have just a few more minutes, and like I said, we could talk forever, but did it leave my mind? You were talking about access and videos and things. Oh my goodness, it left my brain. But certainly, Cindy, we tend to open up at the end if anyone has any questions. Cindy, do you have anything in particular you'd like to ask Jason?
There has been so much. I'm amazed at the range of different kinds of projects that you've been involved with. I haven't. If you recall some of the findings from the walk audits, some of the like issues that were mentioned frequently that that affect walkability,
Yeah.
I'd be interested.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one that comes to mind is that, you know, one of the walk audits I did, like we did this walk audit, and then they stopped. Mark stopped, and Mark Fenton stopped, and he's like, "What do you think?" And you know, a couple of people was like, "Yeah, that's a great, you know, walk." And this one woman said, "This is terrible. If I was pushing a stroller with my child, it would be awful." And because there's none of those curb, I can't remember what you
The
call them.
curb cuts,
Curb cut.
yeah.
And this guy's like, "Oh, I never thought about that," right? And then it's like, well, you know, if you had someone in a wheelchair, right?
Yeah.
And so it's such a simple sort of little addition, and then it opened people's minds to that. So if you think about things like that, you're also educating other people within the community about some of the barriers or some of the challenges that other people have. And so when there are city council meetings or, you know, chances to kind of express views, people then suddenly have a different outlook on something that could benefit everyone, right? So
Really interesting.
So I remembered the question I was going to ask, but before I ask it, I also, bouncing off of what you just said, and I know we're running out of time, so if you need to go, let me know. But the idea of the walk audits, and you said there were questions and stuff, how did you collect those data? Were they like just verbal reports? Were people typing things in? Like that, there seems like video recording, audio recording?
Yeah, so I can send you some information again about walk audits, but the person that's trained, and actually I think we actually paid Mark to come in here and do a training for a lot of our community extension folks in your college, and actually some of your faculty as well. So it was actually really cool. We did it in Cary, and happy to share with you, but you do like little segments of a walk, and then there's questions, and then someone is recording all of that data in there.
Yeah, because I can also see that being the nutrition side. I could totally see that being whether it's a community walk for access or even just going through a grocery store and things like that.
Yeah.
That's a really, really good way to identify things that are successful and some barriers there too.
Yeah, for certain, absolutely. And there's a lot of assumptions that people make, like like I'll tell you a quick pandemic story. And have you had Lincoln Larson on here as well?
I don't think so, no.
So
Yeah,
actually, yes, he's someone that you should.
have to write that down.
Yeah. So Lincoln and I and other people, during the pandemic, people talked about how the data that we heard nationally was parks were being used more and more during the pandemic, right? Because, anything from greenways and trails like Lake Johnson, or, parks like Umstead, or, some of the county parks here across the country, where if you speak to park managers, they're like, wow, parks have never been used so much. So what we did, we collected cell phone ping data as well as survey data. And what we found was that parks were being used more. And this was replicated by some of our colleagues at Penn State and other places, but they were being used more by less people.
Mm.
So it wasn't new users that were using them. It was the people, like, say, I'll use you, Susie, right? You love walking around Lake Johnson, but
Which I do.
yeah, but you're a busy faculty member at NC State, so you might only walk around Lake Johnson twice a week because you're there at work and you don't have the time. Well, suddenly you're at home and you're suddenly walking around Lake Johnson 3 to 4 times a day, right? So rather than new people using it, it was regular users just using it more and more often. And that bled into things like some really significant equity issues, right? So if you think around the world, you're only allowed to use these outdoor spaces, but if you don't have access to these outdoor spaces, now start thinking about your mental health, right? And the connection between outdoor space during a pandemic, right? That was sometimes the savior for many of us, right? Like to get out of our house and exercise in a safe space, and those that just do not have access to that. And I think some of the issues related to equity were really exacerbated during the pandemic time. And I think that led to, a lot of questions in terms of like, where are we putting our parks, and looking at the relationship between, where people live, and are they being priced out with gentrification and some of those other equity related issues.
Thank you so much. All the things we could talk about, and it's awesome that I say this every time after we get through our 30 minutes and we're already 5 minutes over, that I could talk to you for hours and hours and we still wouldn't hear all the awesome things you're doing. And I really truly do mean that I want to invite you back, because there was about 8 different things I wanted to, like, when you were like, pick one, there are too many to pick from. Definitely a lot more stuff. Jason, thank you. So I'm going to just take a second to wrap up and to say that we do thank you, Jason, Dr. Vaccaro. I always, like I said, have to stop, for sharing your work. And I want to thank everyone who is watching, whether live or recorded. And just a reminder, we do our broadcast every 3rd Friday of the month at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And we actually don't have someone scheduled for next month yet. So it's going to be a surprise, to figure out who's going to be coming and talking to us more. But if you have any questions or need more information, please feel free to contact us at the website related to Wolfpack Wellness. So until then, be well.